Wow, quite an introduction. I felt my life passing before me. Thank you so much, Professor. I'm delighted to have been invited to speak at this series of events to celebrate the centenary of the foundation of Turkey's Republic. My topic, the significance of Republican themes in the British system of government, is not straightforward, it's fairly complicated. Not having experienced the modern political revolution, the British, as is well known, continue to work with a traditional constitution of evolving laws, customs, and practices. It's a constitution in which the Crown and its prerogative powers formally remain situated at the core of our governing arrangements. It's therefore hardly on the face of it a republican scheme. Nevertheless, the British have, during the modern era, imposed many legal and conventional constraints over the exercise of the Crown's discretionary powers. So, although we retain a monarchical form, and that's evident in the law of the Constitution, much of our modern constitutional practice reflects the influence of Republican ideas. The British commonly claim that these constitutional practices serve to protect the rule of law as much as any other regime, and if, as Rousseau maintained, any state that's ruled by law is a republic, then the British might justifiably claim that despite the monarchical form, their system of government is substantially republican. This is the thrust of the argument that is presented by the great Victorian scholar Walter Bagehot in his influential work on the English Constitution that was published in 1867. Bagehot maintained that Britain had become a disguised republic, the title I've stolen here. As he put it, the British system, in the British system, the republic has insinuated itself within the folds of a monarchy. So in this lecture, I want to examine the importance of Bagehot's claim. My main purpose will be to consider whether Bagehot's 19th century assessment continues to have relevance to understanding the British Constitution today. But I also want to consider whether his general argument and the method by which he develops his argument helps us with a more general issue in constitutional understanding. Specifically, the question is, does he help to explain the continuous pull that a monarchical style of government, and by monarchical style of government I mean today, in its modern form of presidentialism, seems now to be exerting over republican constitutions. Before examining Bagehot's arguments, however, I first need very briefly to sketch Britain's constitutional development in order to situate Bagehot. To begin, in the 17th century, England experienced a series of successive constitutional crises. During the first half of the century, the crisis was over the question of who holds ultimate political authority. Is it the king, as the principle of divine right asserted, or is it Parliament, as the emerging doctrine of Parliament for popular sovereignty, I should say, intimated? The tension between the claims of king and Parliament, eventually came to a head in the 1640s, and by then it was obvious that no political accommodation could be negotiated between these two claims, and the country descended into a state of civil war. The Civil War eventually ended in 1649 with the victory of the parliamentary forces, and what then followed shook the regime to its core. The English did something dramatic. They executed the king and proclaimed a republic. Yet there was a problem. Those who executed the king still believed in the necessity of retaining the office of the king. That is, they couldn't contemplate maintaining the stability and political authority of the regime without the existence of a singular figure who held the office of the sovereign. This ambiguity was, of course, magisterially articulated by Hobbes in 1651 in his great work, Leviathan. Hobbes' argument was resoundingly modern, not least because it sought to explain and justify the establishment of the office of the sovereign as a construction that logically followed from accepting the liberty and equality of the individual. But it was also ambiguous because it was unclear in Hobbes' scheme whether sovereign power must vest in an individual or whether it was an office that could be held in commission, so to speak. The resulting confusion is seen in the fact that within the Republic, which was labelled the Commonwealth, there was a felt need for some sovereign figure who could anchor the authority of the regime. In 1653, when a new constitution, which was called the Instrument of Government, was adopted, Oliver Cromwell was made Lord Protector. This was a new type of office, analogous to what today would be the President. But in 1657, in the Petition and Advice, the Parliament not only sought to restore the second chamber of Parliament, that is the old House of Lords, the aristocratic chamber, but they also proposed to proclaim Cromwell king. Now, their purpose was not to elevate Cromwell even further. Rather, it was to try and sever the direct connection between Cromwell and the army, of which he was the commander-in-chief, and also to place him into an office that, by custom and convention, was bound by law. So they saw the office of the king as an office that was constituted by law, whereas this Lord Protector was limitless power. The problem was sharply expressed by the leveller John Loughlin. Asked whether he preferred a commonwealth or a monarchy, he replied that to have the name of Commonwealth imposed upon us by the sword means simply that we shall be just as much bound in slavery as we were under a king. As a Republican, Loughlин's point was that it was the substance, not the form, that matters. In the event, Cromwell, having the power, had no desire for the pageantry. He refused the crown, but he died the following year, and after an unsuccessful attempt to have his son, Richard, elevated to the role of Lord Protector, in 1660 the Parliament invited Charles II the executed king's son in exile, to return to the throne and restore the ancient constitution. Then, after Charles, well, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but after Charles II died in 1685, his younger brother James became king. But James's modernizing and absolutist policies and his Catholicism, he had been raised in the court of Louis in France, these were unacceptable to the grandees who controlled the Parliament, and they eventually petitioned William of Orange, who was married to Charles I's Protestant daughter, to come to England with an army and bring James to his senses. That is, to use William to require James to comply with the conventional role of the king under what they perceived to be a constitutional monarchy. When William arrived, James fled. He was assumed by Parliament to have abdicated, and they invited William and Mary to take the throne jointly. Now, the significance of that is that having jettisoned the hereditary principle, the succession to the office of the monarch was generally seen to be dependent on parliamentary authorization. So the king that we have is king only because of Parliament. It's not through some divine right, it's not through the rules of hereditary succession, it's because Parliament has authorized it. This process, so-called Glorious Revolution, enabled Parliament to curtail many of the monarch's prerogative powers, formally to assert its ultimate authority, and to establish the form of a constitutional monarchy. And this marks the beginning of the modern era of British constitutional development. During the 18th century, the conflicts that had wrapped the 17th century were resolved, and they were resolved through conceptual abstraction. Who rules? Is it the king, or is it the Parliament? No. The ultimate authority is the king in Parliament. It's a composite abstraction, and it hides all of the difficulties about how power is actually exercised. The main conventions of constitutional government then were established during the 18th century, during this era of relatively stable aristocratic rule. And by the end of the century, a system of representative and responsible government had been established, in which the governmental powers were formally held by the Crown, but were actually being exercised by ministers who enjoyed the confidence of the Parliament. And this system of aristocratic rule, if you like, is our inheritance. It was severely shaped by the upheavals following the revolution in France, the reaction of Britain's political class to the perceived excesses of the French Revolution put the cause of further reform in Britain on the defensive. That is, any Republican movement that existed in Britain in the late 19th century was quashed because of what was happening across the water. The prevailing view was most famously expressed by Edmund Burke in his reflections on the revolution in France, and his argument that the new regime in France could not hold together and would lead to despotism seemed only to be vindicated with the emergence of Napoleon as emperor at the end of that decade. This anti-republican feeling, born of English distrust of the French experience, reinforced the British in their sense of superiority about the evolutionary constitution. And this is the constitution that Bagehot in 1867 seeks to explain. So, let me come on to Bagehot. Walter Bagehot was a polymath, a banker, a barrister, the editor of The Economist, a failed politician, a nonconformist. His books, he wrote many books, his books range over a wide variety of topics, including the workings of the money market, the application of the principles of natural selection to political society, and on the subject of national character. But it's this book, The English Constitution, first published in 1867, that will be the focus of my remarks. Bagehot was a gifted stylist. He exploited the paradox between thought and practice, thought and action, in ways that sought to entertain as much as to educate. And because he wrote as a journalist rather than a scholar, he also felt free to highlight that politics was not just a process of decision-making, but also was a field of theatre and performance. The English Constitution, the book, it should be noted, was written during a period in which America had descended into the Civil War. France was subjected to the Caesaristic style of dictatorship advanced by Napoleon III, and Prussia was little more than a bureaucratic despotism. Consequently, Bagehot's purpose was not only to explain why and how parliamentary government worked in Britain, but also to show that it was much more preferable to other available regimes. Behind the journalistic presentational style, then, lay the concerns of the comparative political analyst. But he was also at pains to explain that the British system of parliamentary government was the product of a particular historical development and was not an arrangement that could easily be exported. Bagehot began by seeking to disabuse readers of the notion that the British Constitution worked in some notion of separation of powers. Montesquieu may have emphasized this as a feature of what he called English government in his classic study on the spirit of the laws in 1748. But in this, Bagehot says, Montesquieu was in error. Nor did Bagehot accept the orthodox accounts of English lawyers, such as William Blackstone, who believed that the British Constitution worked because of some notion of checks and balances. Checks and balances between the legislative, executive, and the judicial branches. Such ideas, Bagehot felt, had been far too readily accepted by the framers of the American Constitution, who actually felt they were putting down on paper the essential template of the British Constitution when they drafted their 1787 Constitution. Bagehot claimed that the British system worked not because of separated or balancing of powers, but because of the fusion of power at the centre. The efficient secret of the British Constitution, he explained, may be described as the close union, the nearly complete fusion of legislative and executive power. I should begin by explaining his method, which is much closer to that of an anthropologist than a political scientist. Constitutions, he argued, can be grasped from two basic perspectives. The first, he calls the dignified version. This focuses on those aspects of the Constitution that, as he says, excite and preserve the reverence of the population. The second, the efficient version, addresses the ways in which government actually works. The dignified version is designed to ensure that the Constitution is able to establish and stabilize its authority, and it's only by first winning the loyalty and confidence of its subjects that the efficient version might be put to work. The dignified parts of the Constitution, states, are those which bring in force and which attract its motive power. The efficient parts are those that employ that power. When the distinction is unpacked, we see that what he calls the dignified version of the Constitution rests on the simplistic idea that the British system is monarchical. The use of the Queen in a dignified capacity, he states, is incalculable. We promote the idea of monarchy because it's an intelligible scheme of government. The mass of mankind understand it, and they hardly anywhere in the world understand any other, he asserts. So let me give you a quotation from it. The nature of the Constitution, he writes, the nature of a Constitution, the action of an assembly, the play of parties, the unseen formation of guiding opinion, are complex facts, difficult to know and easy to mistake. But the action of a single will, the fiat of a single mind, are easy ideas. Anybody can make them out, and no one can ever forget them. When you put before the mass of mankind the question, will you be governed by a king, or will you be governed by a constitution? The inquiry comes out thus: will you be governed in a way you understand, or will you be governed in a way you don't understand? Bagehot is arguing that the ordinary people are incapable of grasping the complexity of modern republican government. They are ruled by their imaginations, or rather, they are ruled by the weakness of their imagination. So he goes on to argue that with respect to gaining authority, the monarchical form has distinct advantages. First, it conveys a simplicity and familiarity of having a country ruled by a specially chosen family. Secondly, monarchy commonly boasted the authority of a system of government with the strength of religion. And when a monarch can bless, he says, when a monarch can bless, it's best that it not be touched. A monarch must be elevated above the commonality of mankind. Should remain mysterious, should be assumed to be incapable of doing wrong, should not be subject too closely to scrutiny. These are essential attributes because in a society of differences, and this is his third point, the monarch stands as a visible symbol of unity. The monarch is the head of the society. Fourthly, we come to regard the monarch not only as the head of society, but also as an expression of collective morality. And then finally, the great role performed by the monarch is that it acts as a disguise. It provides a symbol of permanence and stability, even though behind its cloak, the real rulers are continually changing and are continually changing the terms of government. If monarchy serves the purpose of reverence, such that we must not let daylight in on the magic, it also masks the efficient secret of the Constitution. In a ceremonial and dignified version of the Constitution, the monarch is the head of the government. But in the efficient version, that role is assumed by the Prime Minister. The crown is the fountain of honour, he says, but the treasury is the spring of business. Bagehot also notes that unlike the American system, our first magistrate, the Prime Minister, is not elected directly by the people. Rather, he or she is elected by the representatives of the people. The legislature, the parliament, we think of as elected to make laws. But this is not, in fact, its principal business. Its main task is to make and maintain the government. Bagehot was arguing, in essence, that the British system is one of parliamentary government, a system in which the main function of the House of Commons is to choose the government. But his focus was primarily on what he called his efficient secret, the near fusion of legislative and executive power. The link that connects the two, he says, is the cabinet. The British system is one of cabinet government, a committee drawn from the legislature to form the most powerful institution in the executive. Now, many saw Bagehot's novelty and genius in the emphasis that he gave to the use of the monarchy in its dignified version, and in the identification of the function of the cabinet as the powerful institution and the efficient version of the Constitution. But at the time he wrote, neither of these claims was especially novel. I think the originality of his account lies elsewhere. It's to be found in his explanation of how a monarchy which combines prerogative and symbolic power could actually make republican institutions work more effectively. Bagehot's book is an elaboration on the theme that the king reigns, but ministers govern. And it's the way in which the crown's prerogatives have been acquired by representative and responsible ministers that provides the key to understanding British government. This transfer had not been undertaken by revolutionary rupture and formal reconstitution, but through an evolving political practice. And it's for this reason that Bagehot claimed that a republic had insinuated itself beneath the folds of a monarchy. But this, it must be emphasized, was an aristocratic republic in which the people's continuing belief in monarchy performs the useful role of shrouding them from the harsh realities of political rule. Cabinet government, Bagehot was saying, is good government in a republican spirit of deliberation, but it's only able to function well in a deferential nation. Cabinet government works because the main function of the House of Commons was neither that of legislating nor of controlling the government's finances. These are matters pretty much entirely under the effective control of the government. Its main function was to elect the government and sustain it in office. But he goes on to say that the Commons has a particularly important role to play in guiding the nation. This is a two-way process. First, the Commons, the House of Commons, must express the mind of the English people on all matters that come before it. So it's a forum for expressing and deliberating on popular opinion. And secondly, the other way, it must educate the people. It ought, he says, to teach the nation what it does not know. The challenge, he goes on to say, the challenge for MPs is to know the highest truth which the people will bear, and to inculcate and preach that truth. The real value of Parliament is that it operates to temper factional interests. Nobody, again I'm quoting, nobody will understand parliamentary government who fancies it to be an easy thing. You have the perception of the first elements in this matter till you know that government by a club is a standing wonder. Parliament, he's saying, is a critical part of an elaborate arrangement of aristocratic republicanism. Further, far from being undermined by the existence of a House of Lords, that is the aristocratic second chamber, republicanism, he goes on to argue, is bolstered by its existence. The great utility of the House of Lords, Bagehot argues, is not only in what it creates, but in what it prevents. And what it prevents is the rule of wealth, the religion of gold. They're Bagehot's words, not mine. It also tempers the authority of election. The greatest part of the Lord's power, he argues, is hidden. It's the power of unity of the landed class. And this landed class had an intimate connection with one another. They are educated in the same schools. They know one another's family. They form a common society. They marry the same kind of women, he says, because they're all men. Because they are all the same kind of men. Now, Bagehot here is writing at the high point of Britain's imperial power. And he sought to lay down elegantly and confidently the character of Britain's evolved constitution. Its distinctive characteristic is that of a continuity of form that masks major changes of function. And it was this that enabled the emergence of a system of parliamentary government. And it's this that provides us with a regime of aristocratic republicanism, in which the deference of the old electors to their betters was the only way in which our system could be maintained. That's Bagehot's argument. He's making an argument that the British Constitution is a Republican Constitution. But it's a Republican Constitution that can survive as a Republican Constitution only in the conditions that he identifies in the high Victorian period. He writes the book in 1867. Immediately following its publication, he was obliged to acknowledge that there was a major problem in any writer trying to write about an evolving constitution, and that is it's one that keeps changing. Because what happened is that in the Reform Act of 1867, same year as his book was published, the Reform Act considerably extended the franchise and set Britain on course to becoming a democracy. What did Bagehot do? He quickly produced a second edition. And in this second edition, he expresses great concern about the coming of democracy, fearing that it would lead to the decline of Republican government and lead to the emergence of party government, government by political parties. I can conceive of nothing more corrupting, he writes, than that two combinations of well-taught, well-educated, and rich men, that is the Whigs and the Tories, the two main dominant parties, should constantly defer to the decision of a set of poor and ignorant people, that is the masses. This, for Bagehot, would mark the death of aristocratic republicanism. And this, arguably, is what the 20th century brings about. Democratization ushers in a system of party government in which elective power is transferred from the House of Commons to the party machine, not to the elected, but to the party machines. A Republican regime of government by deliberation is replaced by government by numbers. The advisory role of the second chamber, the aristocratic chamber, is diminished. It's converted into a non-elected body dominated by party placement. It also leads to a growth of government, to the rise of administrative power, and, as Bagehot argued, a skilled bureaucracy is, though it boasts of an appearance of science, quite inconsistent with the true principles of the art of government, that is, the Republican principles of deliberation. These trends culminate in the claim first advanced by Richard Crossman in his introduction to the new edition of Bagehot in 1963, almost a century later, from his first edition, that these various changes have led to the transformation of our system of cabinet government into a system of prime ministerial government. Some constitutional historians doubted that cabinet government ever worked in the way Bagehot had been explained. But a century later, it was gradually being acknowledged to have been relegated to a dignified version of the Constitution. The rule of collective cabinet responsibility was retained, but it had been drastically changed in meaning. In Bagehot's account, it meant the responsibility of a group of equal colleagues for decisions taken collectively after full, free, secretive discussion in which all ministers could participate, that is, in cabinet. A century later, it had come to mean collective obedience by the whole administration, including the ministers, to the will of the person at the apex of power, Prime Minister. Right, to conclude, What can a book written 150 years ago tell us about the British Constitution? Obviously, very little if we read it as a description of the way in which Britain is governed. But does its general method, its anthropological insights, and its comparative analysis still have something of value to teach us today? Bagehot's general approach to the subject, I think, teaches us that it's dangerous to think that we acquire insight into the character of any political regime by studying its formal institutions and the decision-making processes that are prescribed in its documentary constitution. Rather, we must always try to identify how these powers are actually being employed. A constitution, he would say, can't be grasped without appreciating how these institutions resonate with the character of the people and accord with the spirit of the times. He emphasized the necessity of lifting the veil of the formal constitution to inquire into how decisions are made and to discover who in reality holds the reins of power. A constitution, he emphasized, might be monarchical in form, but republican in character. Now, similarly, a constitution can be republican in form, but authoritarian in character. Despite his stress on the importance of examining what he called the efficient version of the Constitution, he also showed how a strictly utilitarian account overlooks the significance that the ornamental and theatrical elements of the Constitution play in binding together the people in some sense of a symbolic unity. Bagehot invoked these ritualistic aspects to show how a constitutional monarchy might provide a more stable, effective, and powerful regime than a presidential system. Simplicity is the key. He emphasizes the charismatic effect of rule by a specially chosen person, especially chosen family. How its authority is bolstered by a religiously inscribed aura, and how such an image can foster a sense of collective morality, collective identity, and provide us with a symbol of the permanence and authority of the regime. Now, is it fanciful to suggest that Bagehot's message is today being taken to heart by presidents within contemporary Republican regimes? Recognizing that the elements which excite the most easy reverence will be the theatrical elements, those which appeal to the senses, convey a sense of superhuman origin, and emphasize the dynastic and charismatic qualities. Presidents appear today to be increasingly assuming the roles of monarchs. And let us be clear, Bagehot believed that parliamentary government is a far superior system to presidentialism. Presidentialism, he argued, leads only to the degradation of public life. Those again are his words. It does so because it separates the executive from the legislature, and therefore the processes of deliberation from the activity of governing. In a presidential system, Bagehot says, legislative debates merely amount to a prologue without a play. In a system of parliamentary government, by contrast, the processes of deliberation and decision are integrated into a single arrangement that binds together government and parliament. It's only through this fusion, Bagehot argues, and argues to be key characteristic of parliamentary government, that an offended public opinion can be forged. But if government by discussion, government by deliberation was a great achievement, we also recognize that it was rather fragile. It depended on a degree of consonance between political power and a political capacity generated by an ability of the electorate to formulate their own views on the issues of the day. And it's for this reason that Bagehot doubted that parliamentary government could survive the emergence of mass democracy. On this, he harbored the typical pessimism of his age and class, contending that the fancy of the mass of men, again I'm quoting, the fancy of the mass of men is incredibly weak. It can see nothing without a visible symbol. For him, and in this he wasn't alone, republicanism could not survive the decline of aristocracy. And on that note, I conclude.
The monarch is the visible symbol of unity. It's a formula. Are there any examples of unifying function of the monarch except of the time during the Second Third War in the United Kingdom? Because you know of the very divided united power for the British Catholics.
Gosh, I'm not the best person to talk about monarchy, but Elizabeth II performed, I think, a unifying function for the British nation. She was on the throne for 70 years. 70 years. Through a series of considerable changes, and maintained a dignified presence by ensuring that she never ever said anything politically contentious. But in most other European regimes where the monarch is retained, they have been stripped down to, I think, a much narrower extent than that still exists in the British monarchy. But maybe I'm not answering. I'm going to change your question. I'd say it performs the unifying function, but here's the problem. It also acts as a major, will imply restraint on our ability to be able to reform our constitution. Because whenever we Brits begin to talk about constitutional reform, we hit a stumbling block of the monarchy. Why, if you're a modern, outward-looking, future-oriented nation, still have a monarchy? It's a question we can't have a sensible discussion about. And we couldn't even have a sensible discussion about when transition was made to our present holder of that esteemed office. Because it incorporates a lot of implicit values that make no sense in contemporary democracy, such as, well, we managed to change this, the principle of male-private genital. We have a monarch who, under the Act of Succession, is the head of the established church in a country that is probably the most secularized, one of the most secularized in the world. We have a monarchy who therefore has to adhere to the Protestant religion, or cannot be a Catholic and accede to the office. These are barriers, but they're not the real barriers, because once you start asking about that, start asking all sorts of questions about everything in its train. Our system, the role that the aristocracy still plays, the House of Lords still plays, changed over the years, our system of honours, all sorts of questions are opened up, and everybody says this is too complicated, shut them down. So when you've had that we call it Republican movements, and I don't mean peripheral Republican movements, Republican movements that have sought to even get to first base and say, let's actually write down our constitution. Everybody ignores the position of the monarchy. You don't touch it. Not your question, sorry.
So that's a very good answer. Thank you very much.
First of all, thank you very much for this wonderful historical travel from 17th century to the 19th century. I have two basic questions. First, because you mentioned the Bagehot's argument on aristocratic republicanism. So what actually this aristocratic republicanism ended in the UK? Was it, for example, when the House of Lords Act enacted in 1911 and 1949, or was it later? This is the first question. And the second question is, after Brexit, scholars in the UK are arguing, who's going to prevent the Parliament from doing whatever it wants? So the criticism of electoral dictatorship of 1970s came back, as far as I read. So are you sharing this concern of the returning to that moment of British democracy as an electoral dictatorship following the Brexit?
The first answer to the first question, when you have any sort of trend of change, identifying a precise moment is always hazardous. But I think you're absolutely right, and the critical moment of the death of the aristocratic republic was 1911. There was a constitutional crisis 1910, 1911, and the constitutional crisis was this. In 1906, we elected a liberal government, and the liberal government sought to introduce a program of social reform, and one of the elements of the social reform was introduce old age pensions for the first time, and a number of other measures, all of which required revenue taxation. And who did they want to tax? The wealthy. And the aristocratic sector, at this stage, the second chamber was entirely aristocratic, except for the bishops of the Church of England. And they broke convention and voted against the budget. They refused to pass this budget because it was going to impose high levels of taxation on the wealthy. And at that moment, the Liberal government went to the King and said, if the Lords don't back down, we are going to ask you to make 500 new Lords. We've heard of court packing. This is court packing on a grand scale. And we are going to demand that we create 500 peers of the realm to sit in the House of Lords, to throw out and to remove the majority of the conservative aristocracy to enable this budget, which we, as the elected government, are authorized to pass. So the King said, no, I can't do that without knowing that it is the permanent will of the British people, and therefore I require you to hold the second general election before we proceed. And they held the second general election, and the Liberals were returned. Not dramatically, the majority actually refused, but they still had a majority government. And at that point, the House of Lords acquiesced and allowed the budget to be passed under the threat of all these new strangers coming into the House. And to give effect to it, the government provoked the Parliament Act of 1911. And the Parliament Act removed the House of Lords' power of veto over any money bill. So when there's any money bill passed by a House of Commons, by the elected chamber, it gets the Royal Assent without the House of Lords' approval, and it converted its general veto power into a delay power. And at that point, it asserted the principle, the overriding principle of democracy over aristocracy, no longer a deliberation between the various houses. And so I think that's the moment at which you see the death of the it coincides too with the Liberal government being a more radical, in Bagehot's terms, party program. It has a manifesto. That's ideological politics. That's different from deliberative politics. And so you have the rise of disciplined political parties in the 20th century. Labour Party was formed only in 1900 and only starts to get a significant amount of electoral representation after the first referendum in 1918 thereabouts. So that's the moment at which you get that. And yeah, it's quite well understood that. And there is a very famous book written in the 1930s called The Strange Death of Liberal England, which is not just the death of the Liberal Party, which does carry if the Labour take the role of the second party, the two-party Britain, but it's also the death of that aristocratic republicanism. On the second, gosh, I wish after the Brexit referendum we had a, believe it or not, I can't believe I'm saying this is not being taped, is it? I wish we had elected dictatorship. What we had was total collapse of any sort of authority. look, we've had a mess since. I'm not here, I'm not going to debate the rights and wrongs of Brexit, on which I've got unorthodox views. That is non-conventional. That's not. I don't follow the majority of my liberal academic colleagues on Brexit. I'm good. I did not vote for Brexit, but the moment it happened, it had to be seen through. I felt that it was vitally important for the sake of whatever is left of our democratic system, that the Parliament, having transferred the decision-making authority to the people in a referendum, rightly or wrongly, had to respect the outcome of that result. And what we are in danger of is the political elite trying to do what all post-democratic regimes in Western Europe do, saying we don't like what the people have decided in a referendum, so let's have another one until we reach the right result. We had to see this through, and I was horrified by the number of my colleagues who were saying we need to have a second referendum, because I think that would destroy the residue of trust in the political system amongst the majority of the people. I'm avoiding. But what we've had since then is a collapse of authority. And it's a long one. I talk forever about this. And how do I say this in a short-handed way? Cameron idiotically calling a referendum without laying the groundwork, resigns. Theresa May takes over. She voted to remain, so it doesn't convince a lot of people that are members of the Home Party that she's going to carry it through. We are fragmented on the terms of Brexit, so we're in a weak bargaining position. Theresa May puts the agreement she's negotiated with the EU to the House of Commons 3 times, and each time it's voted down. So there's a majority always to vote down, but no majority, nobody can come forward with what type of Brexit therefore we want. And so, in frustration, May resigns. The clown, you're not recording this, the clown takes over, but begins by recognizing the basic electoral calculation and destroys the liberal wing of the Conservative Party, suspends the whip from 20-odd Conservative, not backbench MPs, leading ministers, removes the whip from them, forces through the Brexit deal, but by doing so goes to the electorate and gets a massive 60 seat majority. Labour, meanwhile, the representative of the so-called working class, was calling for a second referendum, yet 2/3 of the Labour MPs sat in constituency where their constituency had voted to leave. So they got annihilated. Boris Johnson gets a healthy majority, but he's temperamentally incapable of being an effective Prime Minister. And he goes not for great reasons, but lots of other reasons of incompetence. I want to blank over the 50 days of Liz Truss's so-called premiership. And we now have a zombie government. That is, well, it can't do anything. We're all sitting around waiting for the next election. So whatever that episode is, and I don't see any elected dictatorship in it. There's lots of ways to characterize that. And it's an unfortunate episode. And at one point, I actually thought that when Johnson got the majority, the normal arrangements of parliamentary government could be restored. But that fails to take into account the guy and the apex of power. Yeah, we're not in a great state.
Do you think that COVID-19 brought about a certain type of negative protection about the whole subject? Because there was parliamentary unity around that, if not.
Yeah, that's a very good question. On which here I will display I'll go back to conventional professionalism and say, there was a major inquiry taking place on what happened in government with respect to COVID-19, and we will find out the results of that. But on elected dictatorship, so one of our former Supreme Court justices, Lord Sumption called the powers acquired and the way in which they used their powers by government as being tantamount to creating in Britain a police state. And he got a lot of criticism for that. But Assumption is a libertarian, and that's why he would say that. And there are plenty of people who are libertarian who would agree with her. Is it elected dictatorship? Again, I think there's something. What I'm trying to say, I may be just contrary, but I see something in elected dictatorship. And that is the days when you knew what a political party stood for, what its manifesto was, and how it was intended to go about implementing it. I don't see that any evidence of there being a cohesive philosophy of government, and this is what the COVID inquiry presently sitting is revealing on a daily basis. There was, after half of government, incompetence, fecklessness, inability to maintain a strategy, dishonesty. I mean, yes, from an objective point of view, you look back and think, we have opposed, the government opposed a cruel lockdown on the population, the negative impacts of which for a lot who will not be fully revealed for some time, for a virus that ended up mainly killing older people with underlying health conditions. And it's a terrible utilitarian calculus that one would have to make in order to determine that. But some would say that the government got the balance in the Sorry, I'm wandering around that, but I don't think it shows elected dictatorship, whatever else it shows.
Can I ask another question? So you're talking about Badger and his distinction between efficient and dignified governance. I mean, if you think about that theoretically, do you think that in identifying that distinction, he contributed to the demoralization of politics by drawing attention to the dignified parts and therefore isolating its relation to the efficient part and encouraging everybody to look at the efficient part, which then would be seen as a machine that nobody could quite do?
If one can look at one aspect of if one looks at the utilitarian aspect of Bagehot's analysis, yes, it contributes to the acknowledgement that the British system is one of the machinery of government, and elected dictatorship is the almost natural outcome of this 100 years later. Yeah, I think that's right.
In which case was a mistake to write.
Well, he said, I hope it's budget. So he said he was writing this for the other 10,000. He wasn't writing it for me. Yeah. Was it a mistake to write it? It gave us subsequently a lot of entertainment. I think when he wrote the first edition, when he wrote before the Reform Act, well, I think he was extolling the virtues of the British system of parliamentary government. It is by far a better system than the American or the French or the Prussian. He didn't have good things to say about the Turks either. Yeah. And he was upended like a lot of intellectuals of that period were by the Second Reform.
Thank you for the presentation. It's a general question, but I wonder about your opinion as a British lawyer. Do you think there is a written and rigid constitution in the UK today, or is it better to continue like that?
Do we have a written constitution? I mean,
No, should you have? Is it
the whole discussion that has taken place over the last few decades in Britain about whether we should have a written constitution is false. Because no one really, when they say we should have a written constitution, means we should reduce to writing the rules by which we are governed. Everyone, when they say we should have a written constitution, they mean we should have a different constitution. So just writing down the rule, which is what we have been doing, because the whole of the reform of British government, not the whole, I'm exaggerating obviously, but a lot of the reforms to the formal constitution over the last few decades have been attempts to reduce conventional understanding of these practices into rules. So we have documents like the Ministerial Code, or we have the Nolan Principles and the 7 Principles of Public Life, and these are the standards. We have a committee that oversees these standards. What we're doing is to say that these conventional practices that have served us well over many decades, certainly, are no longer carrying the authority they once had. Again, it might be a facet of the breakdown of either aristocracy or just gentlemanly conduct, if I can use that expression. And now we have to reduce these rules to writing in order to try to bolster them. But when people talk about we need a written constitution, they're really saying we need constitutional reform, we need a different type of constitution. Because, no, I thought I was going to go somewhere else. was thinking of Woodrow Wilson saying right at the beginning of the 20th century that the American Constitution today, as in the beginning of the 20th century, is just as unwritten as the British Constitution. That is to say, you have especially if you have a constitution like the American Constitution as a concise framework document. If you think about the Constitution just as the rules that regulate political life, then the Americans have as many unwritten rules that are not in there, and really powerful rules like the filibuster rule in relation to which makes the Senate no longer a democratic chamber. It requires a supermajority to get things through the Senate because of this filibuster rule has evolved. It's a really powerful constitutional rule. It's not written down in the Constitution.
Thank you for coming here again. At some point you mentioned that head of state has the role of representing and reflecting the collective morality of society. So could you please elaborate on this a little bit, and how would you differentiate your perspective from a far-right populist?
First, when I say that the role of the head of state is to project an image of the collective morality of the people, it's not me speaking, it's Bagehot speaking. That's what Bagehot says is the function of the role of the monarch, or in the modern guise, the president. Would I differentiate that from populists? No. That's the point that I was seeking to make is that many, what you call them republican regimes, or constitutional democracy, or the regime that form their constitutional democracies, are across the world found not really to be working as well as we might have hoped them to be working. And these constitutional democracies, these republican regimes, are not being overthrown by coup d'etat. They are being subverted by the growth of rulers, those who acquire power, often presidents, subverting the constraints, the various constraints within the Constitution, and hollowing out the democratic system to convert it by stealth often, sometimes formally, but often by stealth, into more authoritarian forms of existence. And they're doing that in the name of the people, and therefore projecting an image of the people. It's often not one that's entirely unitary, but if by populist you mean something like Orban's Hungary, well, the Magyars, my understanding, form 85 ethnically, form 85% of the population of Hungary, and therefore we can see it as a projection of Hungary for the Hungarians it's not even totally unified, but it's a strong majoritarian projection. Or if we look at Modi in India, similarly, the Muslim minority, forget about other minorities at this point, I'm not going to be too happy about the projection of the Hindutva type of projection. But these are ways in which these rulers are seeking to aggrandize their power, and this I'm speculating, by projecting an image of themselves as a representation of the nation, and the nation in a particular image, which will be offensive to minorities, but it's the rise of this sort of, well, in the formula that Orwell himself used, the liberal democracies. Don't know if that entirely answers your question. It's the best I can do.
Thank you for your presentation. In your book, Against Constitutionalism, you wrote that the role of constitutions is transformed from that of an instrument of collective decision-making. The role of the constitutions is transformed from that of an instrument of collective decision-making to into collective decision-making, into a symbol of collective positive identities.
Yeah.
And you are critical to this transformation because you are critical to rights revolution. You are critical to rights revolution.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is this applicable to British constitutionalism? And what is the I don't know, symbol of collective political identity in British constitutionalism for you?
Thank you. No. Short answer is no, it isn't applicable to Britain. The book is a critique of a modern invention, that is the written constitution, the written entrenched fundamental constitution, which then results in the creation of a set of hierarchical ordering of laws, and none of that is applicable to the British Constitution, which has, by tradition, got no notion of a hierarchy of laws. There's only one highest will, and that's what the Crown in Parliament enacts as law is it. And the problem of the British Constitution, so I don't think that is right. The rights revolution has certainly affected the British like it's affected every other nation on earth, probably. Well, I don't know. A bit of an exaggeration, every other nation, but all advanced societies seem to have gone through this process. But we were talking earlier about the Human Rights Act in Britain and its accommodation to the, what I call the shibboleth of parliamentary sovereignty by prohibiting the judiciary from having the authority to declare an act of parliament invalid. So I don't think it's affected. It's not affected. Constitutionalism has had an influence, but it's not transformed the British system in the way that it has other regimes. But what then is a symbol of collective political identity? We don't have one, that's our problem. When there was a poll taken, it's some years ago now, so I'm relying on old, when one of these polls were taken in Europe about which institution do you most admire, the Germans said, constitutional and the British said, the monarchy.
Yeah.
Our problem is, it's not unique, it's uniquely ours in its particulars and its detail, but our problem is the same as every other country's at one level. That is, building a sense of a unity, the symbolic political unity of a people in a world of mass migration, growing diversity, ethnic, linguistic, geographical, religious. There is a great book, I'm changing the subject, very nice, interesting book. Levitsky and Ziegler wrote a book back in 2019 called How Democracies Die. And this was an analysis of how democracies have been, I'm probably just stole their argument when I said authoritarian rulers destroy democracies from within rather than overthrow. So it's the rise of authoritarian. How Democracies Die in 2019 is a book about how democracies are hollowed out. But that's not what I'm interested in. They just brought out a book called Tyranny of the Minority. And what they are arguing, it's mainly about the United States, not surprisingly the American political science. But what they argue is to put it really in an interesting light, and that is that the United States today faces, I'm getting up Britain, so you know the United States. The United States faces a major problem that no country on earth has ever been able to address, has ever addressed. And that is, how do you build a mass democracy without a dominant ethnic group? When you think about it, all of our democracies have emerged through a dominant ethnic group. America today, 40% of the population are either African American, Afro-American, Hispanic, Native American, or Asian American. And those four groups form a majority of the under 18 population. So within a generation, they will be the dominant ethnic group as the white Christian European immigrants will be in a minority, and there will be no majority. And how do you build a democracy without that? And they are presenting this as a real problem. And the real problem in their way is the Constitution, because the Constitution entrenches counter-majoritarian devices. One of them I just illustrated, the filibuster rule, but there are many others, such as the Supreme Court, that seem to out of step with the majority public opinion on many social issues, askew in all of their electoral system to the Republican Party, which is the most conservative aspect of this arrangement, that is to say, Al Gore lost the 2000 election, even though he had a majority of the popular vote, failed by 5 votes or so to win the Electoral College. Hillary Clinton lost the election, even though she had a majority of the votes, minority in the Electoral. The Electoral College has a skew towards Republicans. The Senate, because of its overrepresentation of small rural states, has a skew towards the Republican Party. And they show how building, I'm trying to get back to the point, building a sense of a collective political identity of some sort will be a real task for the Americans in the very near future. And yet their institutional arrangements are such that the barriers against them being able to rise to that task are not great. I mean, they are great, sorry, the rise to the challenge will be made more difficult because of the institutional arrangements. But I think that's a problem that all democracies are facing. I don't know why I'm talking about this. I'm a mere lawyer who just tinkers with the rules.
And the French has done it in the 18th century with education to shape the nation, but it's also dominant, has been a dominant nation.
And that's what that's why the French are not in my polemical analysis part of that constitutionalist revolution, because they had a clear sense of themselves as a nation, as a people, as a state, without any constitution. It's only those nations that, through history, have had to rebuild their identity, and at that critical moment use the constitution as the technique through which they seek to build identity that I was being critical of. But the French have the same problem today. They had a strong sense of a nation, but yeah, they have not just one of the highest Muslim populations, but also one of the highest Jewish populations in Western Europe, certainly.
Okay. I have another question. Against constitutionalism, you mentioned that gender and racial equality struggles are the greatest struggles for recognition as part of recognition for being part of the nation. You admire their struggles, but you don't like the idea of judicial interpretation of gender equality. You don't like, as far as I understood, you are against the idea of adjudication of gender politics.
Yeah.
So, who should recognize gender equality rights?
Okay.
The parliamentary majority? Because you said that government by deliberation
You hit me at my weakest point.
You said that government by deliberation is transformed into government by numbers.
Yeah,
So
that's what Bagehot said.
Majority.
Well, that's what I interpreted. Yeah.
Yeah. Concerning
Okay.
concerning
But
the
let's-
majorities.
Okay. I'm turning the question back on you. Do you really think courts have been the medium through which this social change that promotes gender or racial equality has come about? I don't see evidence for that. John Hart Ely, back to the American illustration, wrote a very influential book in the 1980s, Democracy and Distrust, where he says that the key function of judicial review is to open the channels, the block channels of political channels that prevent these discrete and insular minorities, and I know women are not a minority, from having full access to political representation. And everyone says that's a great theory. But when you look at the evidence, it's not borne out by the empirical evidence that courts have ever done this, certainly not in the American system. Yes, there are barriers, but the barriers are constitutional. The Equal Rights Amendment was first introduced in the United States to bring about the amendment of the Constitution in 1920. It's been pushed and pushed and pushed. There have been votes on it. There have been majority votes in legislatures, both in states and at the federal level for it, and yet it's not been adopted. Why? Well, it's not. It's because of the entrenchment of the American Constitution, the impossibility of bringing about amendment. But the British, I'm not holding up the British as a sort of model of any of this, but we brought about legislation through Equal Pay Act and Sex Discrimination Act and Racial Discrimination Act by ordinary legislation in the 60s and 70s. We brought in liberalisation of abortion in ordinary legislation in 1968. I'm not to say the struggle's over there, but didn't require innovative, invented constitutional interpretation by courts to bring that about. And if one looked at if one did a comparative study, which I'm not confident to do, of the social reforms on racial and sexual equality that's been brought about, just say, in advanced Western European countries over the last 50 years, I think you'll find that, I'm guessing, but I think you'll find that virtually a real advances were made by legislation, not by innovative judicial interpretation. It's a mark of the utter failure of democracy that you rely on courts to usher in these changes. And there's a limit to how far courts can even go with this, because going back to 19th century American president, as Andrew Jackson said when the Supreme Court issued a ruling he didn't agree with, the court made the ruling, let them enforce it. These changes require political action, they require executive action, they require resource to be put in to be made real. Who's going to do that? It can only be the political branches of the state, so if they don't agree, the courts can symbolically declare some right, but it's not going to be a real right, as Benford would say. So I hold on to my position. I don't think of courts, perhaps temperamentally, because I come from the British tradition in which our courts were born to be conservative. I don't see courts as, and I remember when going over a long time ago now to study in the United States, and had all these crazy American constitutional lawyers teaching constitutional law as though the revolution was going to come through the Supreme Court. All we need is more of these innovative constitutional rulings and America would be transformed. I don't think anything did more to improve the lot of certainly racial, the African Americans than the Civil Rights Act of 1964, not Brown Board of Education. Brown Board of Education may be really important, but it required implementation. And that can only come about through political institutions.
Thank you very much for being with us to all. And we intend to publish the papers of the talk series, and I will hope that then we can discuss further about your arguments. Thank you very much.